So in this video, we look at the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia was a treaty that fundamentally changed how the world was organized. The Peace of Westphalia led to the introduction of a state, the modern notion of states. The Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648 following the end of the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, created the framework for modern international relations. Now, the concepts of state sovereignty, mediation between nations, and diplomacy all find their origins in this treaty, in the text of this treaty. The Peace of Westphalia was really one of the first attempts to codify an international set of laws. So it was in many ways the birth of international law. As I said, to understand the Peace of Westphalia, you have to at least know about the 30 Years' War. You really don't need to understand it. Just know that it was a religious conflict, and it was fought between feuding Catholic and Protestant states within the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was the precursor to the modern state of Germany. It was made up of a number of different principalities, all of whom owed loyalty to the Holy Roman Emperor. Some of the principalities were predominantly Catholic, some of them were predominantly Protestant, and that's what led to this long and bloody conflict. And in fact, the conflict evolved to become a conflict involving most of Europe. We saw Sweden and France and Switzerland all become involved in this war. And in fact, the war was very violent. It killed approximately 3 to 4 million people. You can imagine over 30 years of warfare. Now, what was the war about? Originally, it started as a religious conflict. But what's important for our purposes is that it changed to a political conflict, as it changed from fighting to establish the supremacy of one's particular religion to actual control of territory. And the war also concerned the ability of the leaders of the various principalities to determine the religion of their territories. Now, here we come to the important part, which is to say the Peace of Westphalia established 3 important concepts fundamental to international relations. And you should know these for your exam. First of all, the peace established religious tolerance of other states. Before the peace, states viewed other foreign nations and policies in terms of good and evil, depending on which religion the state or principality was aligned with. There was no middle ground for religious tolerance. There was temporary truces, but there was no ability to agree, because to agree to a compromise would be to suggest that your religion was wrong and the other religion might be right. And in fact, religious leaders, primarily the Pope and representatives of the papacy, objected to the peace for the fear that it would weaken their influence, that in fact the Pope was directing a number of the Catholic states in their war during the 30 Years' War. And what we saw after the Peace of Westphalia was a de-emphasis on religion, and the role of the Christian community was replaced by the rule of the state. And so the state became increasingly more important as compared to religion. Now, the peace also established the concept of diplomacy and negotiation. Before 1648, war was an accepted means of foreign policy. When a country was acting in a way that you did not agree with, then war was just a natural means of achieving your aims. It was accepted as a means of foreign policy. But after the peace, war was no longer about destroying the other country, that states would continue after the cessation of violence, that parties could agree to work out compromises. Diplomacy and negotiation became increasingly important following the Peace of Westphalia. For the first time, diplomacy was possible. Negotiation was possible because the world was no longer seen as a conflict between good and evil. Now, most importantly, the peace established the idea of state sovereignty. The peace gave to provincial princes substantially increased power while reducing that of the Holy Roman Emperor, meaning local ruling authorities gained in power as the centralized authority, the Holy Roman Empire, lessened. The peace gave to the princes the power to levy taxes, to declare war, and to ratify peace treaties. And all of those powers were originally vested in the Holy Roman Emperor. But what we saw after the peace is power became much more decentralized, spread out among multiple authorities. Now, the peace replaced the feudal system with a system of co-equal sovereign entities. And when we talk about sovereignty, the sovereignty comes from this Peace of Westphalia. And Westphalian sovereignty reflects that the principle in international law that each nation state has exclusive control over all affairs within its borders. And in fact, states are restrained from interfering in each other's domestic affairs. That every state, no matter how large or small, has an equal right to sovereignty. And the best means of checking the ambition of your neighbors is to approach other neighbors and establish a balance of power. So every state has exclusive authority over the affairs within its borders. And every state, no matter how large or small, is equal in their sovereignty to every other state. Now, what resulted is that the peace built the framework of modern international relations. For instance, the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, was based in large part on the principles established by the Peace of Westphalia. The peace further provided the basis for international communities like the European Union and the United Nations, that in fact these entities, although co-equal, could also join in an alliance of sort. And in fact, some would suggest that even the United States was based on this same notion of, as provided by the Peace of Westphalia, that Westphalia in many ways was just like Philadelphia. Now, issues of state sovereignty, religious tolerance, and diplomatic solutions to international warfare form the core of international relations. And all of those came out of the Peace of Westphalia. So in conclusion, what do we learn today? The Peace of Westphalia created the modern notion of statehood. The Westphalian system still remains the model for international relations. And the concept of state sovereignty remains the basis for modern international treaties and conventions. That's all. Thanks for listening.